Welcome to my channel. I'm Mark Gingras. Today I'm going to talk to you about DSCM, Depot Supply Chain Management, and how they interface with the Air Force and DLA, kind of what their roles are. So let's get started. DSCM is DSCM, Depot Supply Chain Management, is what you'll hear them referred to quite a bit. Okay, so the Air Force, what do? They fly aircraft. They're flying this jet. They might be running some vehicles or some tanks, whatever, maybe more for the Army, but you get the idea. They predict the future of how many hours do they plan on flying this jet. What are their missions? What is headquarters' mission for this jet? So based on that mission, they're going to fly so many hours. Every time they fly, they are going to break things, like break radios. So let's go ahead and draw some lines here from the jet to the radio. So they break a certain amount of radios per amount of flying hours, okay? So when these radios break, they have just piece parts of that radio that are broken, like the capacitors or the resistors. So you have a resistor that breaks, you have a capacitor that breaks, you might have this inductor here that breaks. And they break at certain rates. So let's just call this a capacitor, resistor, and inductor. And you even have the chassis of the radio itself that could break. It could get crushed or dented or something like that. So every time this radio comes in, you're going to replace it at the capacitor at 20%, the resistor at 30%. Maybe this inductor is replaced every single time this radio comes in because it's a very important part, or maybe it just breaks all the time, one or the other. Chassis, probably 0%, right? You almost never break the chassis. Once in a while it might happen, but not enough to actually statistically count in this aspect. That's what the A-bomb is. It's a bill of materials. It's the actual bill of materials that are used to fix this radio. So they got to keep track of all this stuff. Most of these parts, these component parts, these piece parts, come from DLA, Defense Logistics Agency. So DSCM and DLA interact. So you have your Defense Logistics Agency that are going to probably support you with all these parts. They all have lead times. They all have lead times to get under contract. They have lead times to get the parts delivered. So they have to know how many approximately do I have, how many do I need in the future, and when do I replace them, etc., etc. While we're talking about the bombs, let's talk about the P-bomb. So the P, part of the P-bomb is planned, and the A is actual. That's how I remember it. Actual bomb, what actually happened. The mechanic actually threw this one away because it was bad. Planned bomb is what I plan on in the future. Well, I've been talking to a couple of vendors, and that capacitor, we got down to a new material that's going to make it replaced at 5% because it's going to last longer. And same thing with the resistor. Maybe we got a better resistor. We're going to go down to 10%. And that inductor, after all, we talked to engineering, and they said, you know what? It's actually not a critical part, or you can degrade it, and it's perfectly fine. So maybe we can just replace that, every other time it comes in to be safe. And the chassis is still 0. Okay. So that's the future. We plan on doing this, but we have been doing this. Why is that important? Well, because DLA looks at historical only. They don't actually look at the future unless you override that and you tell them, here's what we plan on doing. We do a demand data exchange, a DDE. We exchange the knowledge of our demand that's going to change. The demand is going to change because our replacement rates have changed. Now, it's not necessarily DSCM's job to do that. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what the Air Force side is. So the Air Force actually is the one that's going to do a lot of this work here. The communication part of it, though, sometimes has to go through DSCM because it's such a large workload. There's so many parts. There's so many things that can go wrong. There's so many systems that it's hard to keep track of sometimes. And sometimes Air Force doesn't talk directly to DLA, or they try to, and things get lost in the shuffle. That's where DSCM comes in. They are kind of the liaison that looks at the future of this, and it says, hey, we're not going to be supportable. I noticed DLA is not putting in those purchase requests or contracts that they're supposed to. I noticed that the government or the Air Force side didn't tell DLA that we're going to fly more hours, and therefore our demands are going to go up, right? So all those different things is what DSCM kind of looks at. DSCM's looking at a 2-year future forecast of these radios. How many of these radios are we going to really need? The Air Force might say, hey, we need 20 of these radios next month, but then DSCM looks at all the other data, some other stuff that we didn't think about, and they said, no, you're actually going to need 30 of these radios. Did you tell DLA? And the Air Force is going to say, oh, no, I didn't because I didn't think of that. Now, this isn't always the case. This is just one simple scenario. DSCM is kind of the liaison between Air Force and DLA, regardless of how you want to look at it. Okay, so we have all these parts. We have all these bill of material parts that I believe the planner in the shops actually keep track of the actual BOM, and the loggies in the supply chain keep track of the P-BOM. Okay, let's see what's next here. So what can you do? So the DSCM, as well as the loggie in the Air Force, and including DLA as well. I mean, we're all on the same page. We're all fighting the same fight. But we need, 3 eyes are better than 1 or 2, right? So DSCM can get in there and say, hey, DLA, can you request a delivery sooner? And it's not necessarily just DLA side. DSCM can talk to the Air Force side as well and talk the same talk. They would talk to the buyers, the people that are negotiating with the contractors and the vendors for these parts. So DSCM has free reign to kind of navigate the whole spectrum, but with the loggie and DLA, they're in the loop as well, and because it's part of their job as well. Request the contract. Hey, the contract hasn't been awarded yet. It was supposed to. You said the contract was going to award in 30 days. It's been 35. I still don't see a contract. Let's look into that. So that's what DSCM is going to help do. Request purchase requests. So maybe there's no contract in place, but hey, you never even asked for a contract, but you should have based on the data that DSCM looks at. They're looking at a slightly different scenario than the supply chain suite that we have in the Air Force. They're looking at different things that the system may be lacking, so to speak. Engineering waiver. Maybe we can extend the life of that capacitor or the whole radio itself. Maybe we can replace certain parts less so that we can keep going and fly, right? Substitute parts. Maybe we can find parts at a third-party vendor. Maybe we could find a surplus vendor. Maybe we have parts that are already on the shelves that are just slightly different, maybe a different material, maybe a different life, but they have the same resistance, same everything else, right? So substitute parts is one other thing. Change of maintenance practices. Maybe the technician wasn't trained correctly how to solder that specific inductor. Maybe it needed a special solder technique that every time he did it, maybe that's why it broke 100% of the time. Maybe they were supposed to check something and they tried to solder it back and it was always broken. Whatever it might be, change in maintenance practices might be some sort of solution. But these are just ideas of what some of the things DSCM is kind of looking after. A lot of them overlap with what the loggie does, and a lot of them overlap with what DLA already does. But we need that overlap because if you think about it, there are thousands and thousands of parts, and there's multitude of systems that we're relying on to help us with these parts. But sometimes you need that human engagement, that human interaction. These DSCM guys or girls are picking up the phone, calling these people, trying to get things in place at the right time when we need it. They're trying to find workarounds and solutions. This is just part of the huge piece that they actually do. So with that being said, I hope you like this page, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next video.